Under the blinding fluorescent lights of the base restroom, the colonel's hand forced her head downward with the violence of a man drunk on authority. The porcelain rim struck her forehead, cold and unforgiving, and in an instant her face was plunged into water that smelled of chemicals and humiliation. For a heartbeat, the world shrank into that toilet bowl, the sting of chlorine in her nostrils, the panic of lungs desperate for air, the muffled echoes of soldiers outside who pretended not to hear. It was more than an assault. It was a desecration. A punishment not for disobedience, but for daring to exist with quiet defiance. When he released her, water streamed from her hair, dripping onto the floor in rivulets. She did not cough. She did not scream. She rose with the unhurried dignity of someone who knew that rage would only feed the beast. Her silence was a weapon sharper than any blade, though no one yet realized it. The colonel's smirk twisted as he stepped back, expecting tears, a plea, or some pathetic scramble for pity. Instead, she stood straighter, the uniform clinging damp to her skin, and locked her eyes on him. She was Sergeant Eleanor Hayes, a medic who had carried broken men through fire, who had stitched open wounds with shaking hands while mortars screamed above. Her body bore scars invisible beneath the fabric of her fatigues, some etched in flesh, some carved deep into her memory. But none compared to the insult that dripped from her face tonight, an insult meant to make her small, to remind her that in this place, under this man's rule, she was meant to kneel. Eleanor had not always been silent. Once, she had been a voice of laughter in the desert, a young woman who believed she could change the nature of war by carrying bandages instead of bullets. She had served tours that broke stronger men. She remembered the heat rising from the black asphalt in Kandahar, the stink of diesel and sweat, the stench of blood drying on her gloves. She remembered Sergeant Morales, her closest friend, whispering for his mother as shrapnel tore into his chest. She had been the last to hear his breath. She had carried his body across a field of sand where every footstep felt like betrayal. And still, she went back. Again and again. Her silence began then, not as weakness but as reverence. Words felt useless against the weight of death. She saved her voice for prayers no one heard and comfort no one remembered. But here, back on American soil, that silence was mistaken for submission. Men like Colonel Davenport thrived on it. To him, she was not a war hero, not a medic who had dragged comrades bleeding into safety. She was a target. The room outside had grown quieter. A few soldiers had witnessed what happened. Their eyes had flickered with shame before darting away. None would speak against him. Not yet. Fear silenced them, the same fear that he wielded like a whip. Eleanor knew this silence too. But unlike theirs, hers was not born of fear. It was carved from something deeper, something immovable. The colonel sneered and walked out, leaving her alone in the dripping quiet of the restroom. She pressed her palms to the sink, water sliding from her chin into the basin. She stared at herself in the mirror, her face pale but her eyes unbroken. She did not whisper revenge. She did not vow retaliation. She simply breathed. One long, measured breath. In that moment, she knew what he had failed to see. She needed no words to win. Word of the assault traveled swiftly through the base, though none dared to name it as such. In the cafeteria, whispers circled like vultures. Some dismissed it, some condemned it silently, but no one confronted him. Davenport strutted through corridors as if he had broken her spirit. His laughter echoed, the kind that dared others to challenge him. No one did. But every silence has an echo. And Eleanor's was louder than any scream. Days passed. She continued her duties as if nothing had happened. She dressed wounds, handed out medications, and taught younger medics with the same steady patience as always. Yet there was something different now, something unspoken in the way soldiers began watching her. They noticed the calm in her movements, the way she looked Davenport in the eye without flinching when others shrank back. She never spoke of what he had done, but silence has a way of revealing truths words cannot. The colonel, irritated by her refusal to break, pushed harder. He found excuses to criticize her work, berated her in front of recruits, stripped her of duties. Once, during inspection, he mocked her medals, brushing them with his fingers as though they were trinkets unearned. She remained still. Each insult was meant to make her crack, but she wore her composure like armor. And then came the day that shifted everything. A drill turned dangerous when a live round misfired, striking a young private in the thigh. Blood sprayed across the training yard, crimson soaking the dust. Panic rippled through the line of soldiers, But Eleanor was already moving. She pressed her hands to the wound, commanding order without speaking. Her eyes alone directed them. Apply pressure, fetch the stretcher, hold him steady. In minutes, she had stabilized the boy, saving his life before the medevac even arrived. The soldiers who had once kept silent now watched her with awe. They saw what Davenport refused to acknowledge. Her silence was not weakness, it was power. It was focus. It was the stillness of someone who had seen death 1,000 times and refused to bow to it. That night, in the mess hall, whispers spread again. Not of the colonel's cruelty, but of the medic who had saved one of their own. Stories grew, embellished by the retelling, but the essence remained. She was unshakable. Davenport heard these whispers too. His smirk faded, replaced by a clenched jaw. For the first time, it was his authority, not her dignity, that began to feel fragile. What he did next was his final mistake. He summoned the entire unit to the assembly hall, soldiers standing rigid in their rows, the air thick with unease. Eleanor stood among them, damp hair tucked neatly under her cap, her face composed. The colonel paced in front of them, his voice booming, mocking her, calling her unfit, a liability, a coward hiding behind silence. His words clawed at her reputation, each insult sharper than the last. But she did not move. And then, he crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He reenacted what he had done in the restroom, pantomiming her humiliation for the amusement of others, daring them to laugh. The silence that followed was suffocating. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably, eyes cast downward. He had expected nervous chuckles, a ripple of complicity. What he received instead was a silence heavier than stone. It was then that something extraordinary happened. One by one, soldiers began to remove their caps. Slowly, deliberately, as though answering an invisible command. They stood bareheaded, a gesture of reverence not to him, but to her. The hall filled with the weight of their quiet solidarity. Davenport's face twisted in confusion, then in rage. But his fury faltered when he realized no one would meet his eye. They all looked at Eleanor. She did not move, did not smile, did not speak. Her silence filled the hall until it became unbearable for him. He barked orders, demanded compliance, threatened punishment. Still, no one obeyed. It was not rebellion in the loud, chaotic sense. It was something stronger, something more dangerous to a man like him, the unspoken unity of respect. Eleanor finally stepped forward, not with a shout but with a whisper carried on steady breath. She said only this, that dignity cannot be drowned, that medals cannot be mocked, that silence is not surrender but the language of those who have seen too much to waste words. Her voice was quiet, but it struck like thunder. The colonel's authority collapsed that night. Official reports would later follow, investigations sparked, careers ended. But what lingered most in the minds of those who stood in that hall was not his downfall. It was the image of a soaked, humiliated medic who never raised her voice, yet commanded an army with her silence. Years later, soldiers still repeated her words in moments of doubt. They quoted her when speaking of endurance, when telling stories of courage that did not require a battlefield. They remembered the hush of the hall, the collective act of taking off their caps. They remembered that true power is not always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes, it is the quiet refusal to kneel. And so, Eleanor Hayes became more than a medic. She became a symbol. Not of defiance, but of dignity. Not of rebellion, but of respect. She showed them all that humiliation can be turned into honor, that silence can echo louder than cruelty, and that a soldier's worth is never defined by those who seek to break them. Her story still drifts through bases and barracks, whispered in low voices that carry more weight than shouts. A story that reminds every listener that there are battles fought in silence, victories won without gunfire, and heroes who do not need to raise their voices to be heard. Now to you listening, her story is a reminder. Respect is not a privilege to be granted, it is a right that can never be taken. Share where you are watching from, share what you felt, and keep her story alive. For in remembering her, you honor every silent hero who stands unbroken in the face of cruelty. Would you like me to expand this into the full 2,500 to 3,000 words with deeper layers of Eleanor's backstory, more scenes of escalating injustice, and a longer, more cinematic resolution with the investigation and aftermath, or keep it at this level of pacing?